Welcome to Access for All. We're the Access for All team of Wheelchair Boy, The Stone of Truth, and me, Robert Gorski, dissect and explain different aspects of the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA for short. At the end of the previous program in this series, I announced that the subject of today's program would be accessible pedestrian travel. That subject will be saved for the next program because of a talking to given to me by Wheelchair Boy. He argued that although accessible pedestrian travel is a great topic, it would be more appropriate to do something in honor of the 29th anniversary of the ADA, which occurs on July 26. Wheelchair Boy urged me to present the history of accessibility leading up to the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. I consulted the Stone of Truth, and it responded with a warm, fuzzy yes. Well, as fuzzy as a stone can get. Therefore, I am pleased to announce that this show wishes the ADA a happy 29th anniversary and will focus on the history of accessibility. In doing this, I will also explain the importance of two items I have on the table. One is a book titled FDR's Splendid Deception. The other is this emblem designed to celebrate the ADA's 25th anniversary in 2015. In today's program, I'm going to refer mostly to the history of overcoming physical barriers. While I refer to attitudinal barriers once in a while, make no mistake that attitudes toward people with disabilities are the most important part of accessibility and often the hardest to improve. I will begin with today's key phrase, July 26, 1990, the date that President George Bush signed the ADA into law. And now for a very bold statement. Accessibility is mostly an American invention. By that, I mean accessibility as a public policy and as a priority for government action. For most of the time that humans have existed on Earth, people with disabilities have been marginalized members of society. In many early communities, babies born with disabilities were exposed to die. In many early communities, the presence of disability was seen as evidence of disgrace and punishment. Even today, in some parts of Asia, the feeling persists that disability is due to transgression committed by a parent or an ancestor. This attitude continues today with some immigrant communities in America. Until relatively recent modern times, people with disabilities, both figuratively and literally, were confined to back rooms or institutions. They were shut off from the community. At best, they were treated as patients and not as fully human members of society. As a disability advocate who uses a wheelchair said of the civil rights era, while African Americans were forced to sit in the back of the bus, I couldn't even get on the bus. 170 years ago, a young blind man in France named Louis Braille developed a system of raised dots that allowed blind people to read written materials. But he was condemned and opposed by people whose attitude was they knew better what blind people needed. Now, yes, throughout history, there are some instances of better attitudes toward disability and of improving physical access. Still, the best characteristic for most of human history is special accommodation for special people, for a family member, a friend, or an important person. This brings us to the 20th century and this book, FDR's Splendid Deception, published in 1985. This was the first detailed look at Franklin Roosevelt as a person with a disability and the influence of disability on his actions as president. All previous items in the vast library of Roosevelt studies relegated Roosevelt's disability to brief mentions before he was president during much of the Great Depression and most of World War II. If ever there was a spectacular example of special accommodation for special people, it is Roosevelt as president. In order to kowtow to the prevailing attitudes toward disability, the entire country and the world were distracted from the truth. Roosevelt was always described as cured from polio and only needing a little help while walking. In public, Roosevelt was always smiling with his head up. Any photos or motion films showing the extent of his severe disability were confiscated by the Secret Service. The cover of this book features one of only 2 known photographs of Roosevelt sitting in his wheelchair. During his presidency, political cartoons showed him standing, running, or jumping. Yet, according to the author Gallagher, Roosevelt lived in a ramped world. Here's a photo showing the enormous ramp that was constructed so that Roosevelt's car could drive up, level to a building entrance, and he could avoid the entrance steps. After Roosevelt left, the ramp was torn down, and no one talked about it. No one wanted a president with a disability. In fact, a similar incident was the germ for Gallagher's book. In the early 1960s, Gallagher visited a museum in Washington, D.C. that Roosevelt liked to visit after hours. Gallagher had heard something about a ramp to the back door that Roosevelt used to enter the otherwise inaccessible museum. When Gallagher looked, there was no ramp. Museum staff explained that the ramp was removed after Roosevelt died in 1945. It never occurred to staff that the ramp could have been used by other people with disabilities. Nevertheless, within a year of Roosevelt's death in 1945, there was a small, limited change in attitudes toward disability and in accommodating people with disabilities. A group of medical people in the U.S. Army determined that disabled American veterans of World War II were not going to be neglected, as had generally been the case with disabled veterans of previous wars. Believing that veterans with disabilities needed more than just being patched up, these medical personnel gathered existing rehabilitation techniques and invented new ones to help these veterans be a part of American society and not be marginalized. Also, in order to include disabled veterans in the effort to encourage war veterans to go to college, the federal government provided funds to 3 colleges, one in Illinois, one in Missouri, and one in California, to build ramps and other features to make their campuses more physically accessible. In 1948, the Truman administration wanted to encourage American businesses to employ returning veterans with disabilities, and it created the President's Committee to employ disabled veterans. But in a telling shift in the general attitude toward disability, the title and motion of this committee were soon expanded to all persons with disabilities. In actor Marlon Brando's very first film, the 1950 movie called The Men, Brando played a war veteran with a spinal cord injury in a veterans hospital. In many scenes, he uses a wheelchair, and the script includes several references to sex and disability. The movie ends not with Brando regaining an ability to walk. Instead, like many GIs after the war, Brando and his new bride move into a new home, but this house has a ramp to the front door. Nevertheless, for over a decade after World War II, little was done to establish a standardized and comprehensive idea for physical accessibility. Some states and local building codes and some private industry guidelines contain small amounts of information about physical accessibility. but often putting these guidelines into practice was not required and not enforced if it was required. In 1959, an astonishing event occurred. That year, the President's Committee on Disability that was created in 1947, the Veterans Administration, the Easter Seal Society, and an industry research agency called the American National Standards Institute, ANSI or ANSI for short, published ANSI 111.7. This was the world's first professionally researched guide on architectural accessibility. And here it is. It's only 8 pages long. Still, much of the text and many of the illustrations are used today in accessibility standards and guidelines. The ANSI 111.7 was created to encourage states, local governments, and the construction industry to voluntarily adopt guidelines that would make accessibility consistent throughout the nation. In the years following 1959, the ANSI 111.7 was adopted in whole or in part by various code-setting entities, both private and public. But while progress was made in accessibility, it was still a patchwork of a few standards, and enforcement was sometimes problematic. In 1964, a great opportunity for improving accessibility was not taken. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, a seminal document in American history, did not include people with disabilities as a class of Americans for whom discrimination was outlawed. One U.S. Senator, Hubert Humphrey, tried to get disability included, but colleagues on both sides of the aisle demurred, saying, handicapped people don't need rights, they need programs to help them. Nevertheless, a few years later, Congress took small steps in the right direction. First, in 1968, Congress created the U.S. Access Board and gave it the mission of developing and enforcing standards to make federal facilities accessible. But funding was slow in coming after enactment of the law, and it was years before the Access Board was truly functioning. Second, also in 1968, legislation to give federal funds to state rehabilitation programs was up for reauthorization. Some congressmen and staff, disappointed that disability was not included in the 1964 Civil Rights Act, were successful in adding a paragraph to the reauthorization bill. The paragraph is numbered Section 504, and it prohibited any entity that received federal financial assistance from discriminating against people with disabilities. Any entity included every state government, almost every local government and school district, many hospitals and post-secondary education institutions, and quite a few private sector businesses. In these entities, service programs, facilities, and employment practices would be covered. Section 504 was not universally acclaimed in Congress. Conservatives generally condemned it, and President Richard Nixon vetoed the entire reauthorization bill. In 1970, Congress passed the reauthorization again, with Section 504 included. Nixon vetoed again. In 1973, Congress passed it again, but this time Nixon was mired in the Watergate affair, plus other related and unrelated scandals, and he signed the legislation. Generally, federal laws are not worth much until federal agencies write regulations spelling out exactly what the law covers and how it will be enforced. After Nixon signed the 1973 Rehabilitation Act, that included Section 504, first his administration, then the Ford administration, and then the Carter administration refused to publish even the basic template of a regulation. To make a very complicated story short, it took 3 years of public demonstrations, sit-ins at federal facilities, a court suit, and candlelight vigils at the home of Carter administration officials to finally get the regulatory template published. Then each federal agency had to write its own implementing regulations. Some did quickly, others took years. Nevertheless, soon the federal government started informing entities that received federal financial assistance that they had to comply with Section 504. Improvements in public services, employment practices, and physical accessibility started to occur throughout the nation. Most private businesses were not covered by Section 504 because they did not receive any federal financial assistance. Also, there was resistance at the local level. For example, the small town of Ames, Iowa, made national headlines by complaining that it was being forced to build a ramp to the town library, even though no one in the town needed the ramp. Further, a major court defeat occurred when the Supreme Court said that Section 504 did not require an employment accommodation in a surgery setting for a nurse who was deaf. The biggest setback, however, occurred in 1981 when the new Reagan administration scaled back enforcement of and even public information about Section 504. Soon, it was as if Section 504 never existed. This set the stage for advocating that Congress pass a new legislation that would essentially make 504 cover the entire nation and that would implement a minimum standard for physical accessibility throughout the nation. And a new comprehensive accessibility standard was at hand. Remember, the U.S. Access Board, created in 1968 and unfunded for years, by the mid-70s, it was starting to get funds to conduct research in accessibility. By the time of the Reagan administration scaled back on Section 504, a great amount of work had been accomplished. Now to tell the story of the advocacy effort during the 1980s that culminated in the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 would take a documentary worthy of Ken Burns. There was a tremendous amount of work done to stimulate a national awareness among people with disabilities. There were long and sometimes tangled chains of communication among disability advocates. And at times, the communication was tense and competitive. And there was a very quiet and very non-public effort going on inside the White House after George H. Bush became president in 1988. The first version of the ADA failed to pass Congress. A second version was introduced that had several key compromises thought necessary to win the votes needed to pass the act. Some of these compromises were very irksome to disability advocates and continue to be so today. But this version passed both the House of Representatives and the Senate. The iconic photo of President George H. Bush signing the act into law on July 26, 1990, is particularly unusual in two ways. First, although typically a president signs a bill into law with the chief congressional sponsors of the bill around the table, this was not the case with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Around the table, this time, were 4 key disability advocates who had worked on the legislation. Second, the signing did not occur inside the president's Oval Office. It was held outside on the White House lawn because room was needed to accommodate 3,000 spectators who had been invited to attend the signing. This new idea of accessibility being a national priority for all America came just 26 years after it was thought to be inappropriate to include in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. By the way, in 2008, the Civil Rights Act was finally amended to include people with disabilities as a class of people protected from discrimination. Within a year of signing the ADA signing ceremony, a national guidance on physical accessibility was ready to be enforceable standard for the Americans with Disabilities Act. Coverage was not restricted, as was the case with 504, to entities receiving federal financial assistance. The ADA covers all state and local governments and all businesses, both private and nonprofit. Another difference with Section 504 was that federal departments quickly drafted and published the regulations needed to implement the ADA. In 1991, the ADA Accessibility Guidelines was published. It was the work of the U.S. Access Board, the small agency that finally was able to perform the mission for which it was created. Here are those guidelines. As you can see, it's the size of a small pamphlet. It is very readable and has many illustrations to help convey how to design everything from accessible restrooms to accessible elevator buttons. Over the years, the accessibility guidelines have been expanded with greater detail and by adding sections in which the basic guidelines are applied to specific types of facilities, such as swimming pools, outdoor play equipment, courthouses, and even jails, to name a few examples. Today, the U.S. Access Board continues to research the application of the guidelines to more and more aspects of our society. One of the most recent is accessible healthcare facilities and medical diagnostic equipment. Another continuing part of the story of accessibility is the interest by the rest of the world in what America has accomplished. Both developed nations and developing nations have taken notice of the ADA and of accessibility as a necessary part of a modern society. There have been international and regional conferences on accessibility in different parts of the globe. Many nations have passed laws on accessibility, some with a broad scope and some with a very narrow scope. Here's a recent example of American progress in accessibility affecting the world. The nation of Poland has a new law on accessibility, and Polish officials responsible for implementing this law are conferring with the U.S. Access Board during this July, the month of the 29th anniversary of the ADA. The conferring will be done by means of a Skype connection between the United States and Poland on July 10, and it will be open to the public. Interested people can attend in person at the office of the Access Board in Washington, D.C., or they can listen in on a webcast by using the link www.access-board.gov/webcast. The conference runs from 10:30 a.m. to 1 p.m. Pacific time. Now, since the enactment of the ADA in 1990, people have celebrated the major anniversaries of the event in a variety of ways. Here in Pasadena, there have been celebrations every 5 years. In 1995, disability advocates arranged for 3 comedians with disabilities to perform at the Ice House Comedy Club's small stage. In the year 2000, a day-long festival on disability was held in Central Park. In 2005, 2010, and 2015, the city's Accessibility and Disability Commission took a leadership role in encouraging various and sundry ADA anniversary activities throughout the year. To give a recognizable and common thread to the range of activities, the Commission created an anniversary emblem. And here is the edition of the emblem used for the 25th anniversary in 2015. On purpose, its colors are very American, red, white, and blue, with red and white stripes near the center to suggest the American flag. Around the top of the emblem is the date on which the ADA was signed into law, July 26, 1990. Around the bottom of the emblem are the words, "with liberty, justice, and access for all." And that is the source for the name of the program you are watching. Accessibility anniversary celebration activities are informational, such as conferences, seminars, and information tables. They are also fun. For example, during 2015, the local chapter of Hard of Hearing of Los Angeles had a birthday party for the ADA with a birthday cake bearing the ADA's emblem. In the Black History Parade, a banner celebrating the ADA anniversary was carried and received applause along the entire parade route. Later in the year, the banner was carried at the head of a contingent in the Doodah Parade that danced a conga line to celebrate the anniversary year. Repeatedly during the hour prior to a concert at the Rose Bowl, the emblem and a text message about the ADA anniversary was displayed on the Rose Bowl's giant video board. A photograph of the emblem and message on the Rose Bowl video board was sent to the President George H. Bush Center in Texas, and it was added to the center's website. All Americans should be proud of 2 Independence Days in July. The first is on July 4th, and it celebrates our national independence and the democratic ideals we have given to the world. And the second is on July 26th, and it celebrates independence for people with disabilities and the idea of accessibility that America has given to the world. So just as you remember July 4, 1776, also keep in mind today's key phrase, July 26, 1990. Another key phrase to remember is an email address, accessforall.yahoo.com. Use this address to send comments on the program and questions about the ADA. Please keep your questions focused on only the ADA. I won't answer questions about disability insurance, adaptive equipment, or your sister's medical condition. Please tell friends, neighbors, and others about Access for All. Everyone should be interested in the ADA because hardly anyone goes through life without a temporary or permanent experience with disability. In fact, it is appropriate to refer to people who do not have a disability today as temporarily able-bodied, TAB for short. Until the next program, I wish all people with disabilities and all TABs well, and let's look to the day when the Pledge of Allegiance concludes with liberty, justice, and access for all.
Is your business having difficulty filling vacant positions, especially entry-level? Pasadena Civitan is a community group promoting the employment of people with disabilities. Hello, my name is Chancey, and I'm a Pasadena Civitan member. Job developers like me help people with disabilities find jobs, and we want to assist your business to succeed. We have diverse candidates with the abilities you are looking for. For more information about our Pasadena Civitan and our employment programs, email pasadenacivitan@gmail.com. Thank you.